think this quarter, one of the visions that I have for my MATLAB class, I think I'm going to have my students write a library of their own matrix functions. So they're going to be able to write functions that replicate the built-in functionality of MATLAB on their own. And this was stuff that was done in the 1950s and 60s. So it's definitely not state of the art in the sense that from the 60s through the 90s, really, the scholars, the next generation of scholars, like from the 45 until the 60s, basically, Wilkinson and Forsyth, and there was a bunch of scholars whose main job was to take operations in CPUs and make them make linear algebra stuff work on them. And so from that standpoint, like they were a lot of times optimizing these operations on individual machines, doing a lot of analysis on that. And so it ended up that that generation of scholars set the foundation from the like mid 60s to really the 90s. That's actually two generations of scholars. But from that standpoint, as we got into like LSI, VLSI computations, they really started to like optimize so that the base operations had already been figured out. And then they said, like, how do you do this faster? So like the state of the art in the 1950s, if you could solve a 10 by 10 matrix problem on a computer within a few minutes, like that was like top notch, right? By the 1980s, that had gone to like the thousands, and by the 2000s, that's like in the hundreds of thousands. If sparse matrices, you could do millions by millions. And so, you know, one of the things, MATLAB was 1984 that it came around. The whole purpose of MATLAB was to allow folks to be able to take, MATLAB's original was just a matrix calculator. So the whole idea was like, there was no easy way for students to be able to take advantage of matrix calculations in something called BLAS, which is BLAS, basic linear algebra subprograms, because in order to do that, students would have to have a really, really good idea of computer architecture. And then they also have to have access to some computer language that would allow them to import many of those libraries inside. And so what Cleve Moeller said is like, I want my students to be able to work with these ideas, but not have to spend all the time up front become computer scientists. And so he wrote this basic, you know, matrix calculator, which was MATLAB, that allowed students like this portal into matrix world without all the overhead of computer science. And so it ended up like, oh yeah, by the way, matrices are really the state, you know, Steve, one of the things that I was trying to tell you the other day on one of our walks was, you know, if you're serious about going into data analytics and you want a portal to career advancement, like I would definitely not focus on real analysis as the only thing that you focus on, or algebra or whatever. And the reason that is that a lot of computations are based on matrix calculations. And so like when I think about the pyramid of numerical analysis, the individual functions are important for sure. Like how do you calculate sine or square root or whatever. But in terms of like industrial scale computations, all of that is based in matrix calculations, and MATLAB is a prototyping language that allows students to be able to quickly test algorithms based on matrices without a bunch of overhead that would be necessary in a programming language like C, that's a general programming language and has matrix libraries, but it's not designed for matrix libraries. It's designed to solve general problems, right? And so as I've been thinking about my class, as I've been trying to like generate that, one of the things that I thought this quarter, I mean, I've actually thought this for years, but I'm finally, it's like, I will say, it is so nice not to be teaching while I'm generating content, because it like, the amount of work that content generation takes is like 1.5 times the amount of work that it costs to actually like show up and counsel, right? But I think if I can get these basic programming structures in a way that students can fully understand what they're doing, at least at the syntax level, I should be able to have students write entire libraries of matrix functions that rival what they were doing in the 1950s and 60s. Or another way to say that is, by the time the students finish that class, they would have a rudimentary understanding of what's happening under the hood on almost all MATLAB matrix operations, because they'll have coded their own functions. Now, that's not state of the art because it's very far from optimized, but the nice thing is, once my students have that, the rest of it is just like understanding how memory works and what are some of the things that we can do to change Like, you know, how are matrices stored in contiguous memory? Are they stored by rows? Are they stored by columns? What's the cost to go from main memory to cache, from cache to registers? Like, you know, and that's all stuff that if a student decides to go further on that, they can have that. And so anyways, like that is a huge bud. It's like, it's exciting because that's, you know, I've had that vision. It's one of the reasons that I chose to come to Foothill. Like the Math 2B class is really important because it sets the theory behind it, but the MATLAB class is the way that that theory works out. And so it's just fun, you know, this is multiple years of development. It's fun to get to a stage where I'm like, okay, I'm close. Like, you know, within a few years, I should have that whole library set up.